So Star Wars Celebration came and went, and to be honest, it was kind of uneventful. Outside of the Ahsoka trailer and one or two other announcements, the whole event just had this kind of muted feel to it. There wasn't really any hype around it at all. The biggest news out of Celebration was the announcement of 3 new Star Wars films with directors already attached, set in different eras of the Star Wars timeline, and for 2 of these films at least, the response has kind of been a little bit mixed. Now before I get into it, I want to preface this video with a disclaimer. I just want to say that I didn't like the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I liked The Force Awakens, but I really didn't like The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. Now having said that, I had no problem with the cast in these films. Actually, the biggest problem I had with the sequel trilogy was that I think the cast was totally misused. Disney had a great cast with Daisy Ridley, John Boyega, Oscar Isaac and Adam Driver. But because they didn't have an overall plan in place, or really any idea what they were doing film to film, the characters were totally mishandled and just really poorly written. I've seen a lot of people online just laying into the cast of the sequel trilogy, and Daisy Ridley in particular, about her character, and I always thought that was just really unfair to her. Daisy Ridley is a really good actress, and from what I've seen of her in interviews, she seems like a really nice person as well. She, like pretty much all the other actors in the sequel trilogy, were hamstrung by some really terrible writing. Their characters and their development, or lack thereof, was really nothing to do with the actors themselves. It was the writing, it was the material that they were given. I've always been of the mindset that there are no bad characters, only bad writers, and characters like Rey, Finn and Poe could honestly have been huge fan favourites if they were handled right. But since they weren't, the characters really didn't get over with general audiences or fans. So as you can probably guess from that disclaimer, I'm about to talk about the sequel trilogy sequel that was announced with Daisy Ridley returning as Rey and Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy directing. This project was easily the biggest one of the 3 projects announced, and it caught a lot of people by surprise. And I guess my first reaction when I heard about this film was, why? Why are Disney going back to what was probably the most unpopular era in Star Wars, the sequel trilogy era? It's surprising to me that when Disney could have gone in literally any direction with a new film, they decided to go back to the era that most people largely didn't like. Disney are going back to the era that divided the fan base with The Last Jedi and put people off Star Wars on the big screen with The Rise of Skywalker, and that's just baffling to me. I mean, I could understand the decision if the sequel trilogy earned some serious green at the box office, but it really didn't. Each film made less money than the previous one. In fact, The Rise of Skywalker put the whole Star Wars movie division into a coma for almost 4 years. The sequel trilogy did so much damage to the Star Wars brand that Disney had to leave Star Wars, one of the biggest franchise IPs in media history, sit on the shelf in a kind of cooling off period for 4 years, while the higher-ups at Disney came up with a new plan for what to do with Star Wars on film. Believe me, if Star Wars was a healthy brand after The Rise of Skywalker, we wouldn't have been waiting almost 4 years for another Star Wars film to be announced. Seems to me at least, if you're trying to drum up interest in Star Wars again, if you're trying to get people back on board the Star Wars hype train, the sequel era is the one era you would do well to steer clear of. Literally pick any point in this timeline for your next film, and your audience wouldn't be going into the cinema with any of the baggage that comes along with the sequel trilogy. Disney made some really poor choices with the sequel trilogy, and instead of just moving away from them and going in a different direction or just outright ignoring them, Disney looks to be doubling down on them, kind of like how Warner Brothers did with Zack Snyder in the DCEU. Disney have heard that the fans largely didn't like the sequels. They can see from their box office returns that general audiences weren't wild about them either, and their answer to all that feedback after almost 4 years of radio silence was to announce a sequel to their most unpopular trilogy. With a proper writer and some really good character work, you could turn perception of Rey around as a character, but I'm not sure why Disney are going to the trouble of that when they could just as easily have a newly created character come in to lead this new franchise. To be honest, the whole premise of this film, of Rey building a new Jedi Order, that sounds more like what Disney should have done with Luke. There isn't too much known about the other 2 announced projects. James Mangold will be writing and directing a Star Wars movie that focuses on the dawn of the Jedi and the first Jedi to use the Force. This film will be set about 25,000 years before A New Hope. I'm a little bit unsure about this one, to be honest. I have a lot of faith in Mangold as a writer and a director, but I'm not sure this is the Star Wars project I'd want to see someone of his caliber working on. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that they want to know where the Force comes from. I mean, the last time Star Wars tried to explain the Force with midichlorians, the fans really hated that. I've always been of the mindset that the Force doesn't need to be explained. It's one of those cool sci-fi concepts that's just more interesting the less you know about it. The Force, up until the prequels anyway, was this nebulous, unknowable thing, and that was fine. The original trilogy wasn't hurt by not having a scientific explanation as to how people were able to move things with their minds and see the future. You don't need to explain everything. The Force just is, and you don't need to tell the story of the first Jedi to use it. Some things are just better left up to the imagination of the audience. So this is the project I'm most looking forward to. Giving Dave Filoni his own live-action film is a no-brainer really. This film is said to close out the story that's being built across all the interconnected Star Wars shows. This, I think, is the project that stands the best chance of succeeding and actually getting people excited for Star Wars on the big screen again. And Dave Filoni is a guy I have a lot of faith in as a writer and a director, and when I see that he isn't overseeing a Star Wars project or is not in some way actively involved in it, I tend to get a bit wary of it. Filoni has delivered some of the best Star Wars content in the last few years. His character work with Ahsoka has been one of the best things to come out of the Clone Wars show, and if he can bring that same quality writing to this project, like he did with Clone Wars Season 7, I honestly think this project could go a long way to getting people back on board the Star Wars hype train. So yeah, for me, this is the project I'm most excited for. It's not news to anyone that Star Wars as a franchise is kind of in trouble. The film division of Star Wars has pretty much been dead for the last 4 years, and things aren't exactly going great on the small screen either. Outside of The Mandalorian and one or two shows like Clone Wars and Andor, the reception overall to the rest of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows has kind of been mixed to outright bad. Right now, Star Wars feels like it's floundering, and this new film slate isn't doing much to get people pumped for the future of Star Wars back on the big screen. After an almost 4-year absence and several delayed or just outright cancelled projects, Disney needed to get people's attention with this new slate in a big way. They needed to rebuild some goodwill with the fans, and these announced projects, outside of Dave Filoni's film, aren't really doing that. I'm just not feeling any hype or anticipation, and I don't think I'm alone in that. It already feels like these announced projects have already been lost in the next news cycle already. So this video was a little bit different from the content that I usually put out. I had to put this one together really quickly, so I hope it's not too rough sounding. Anyway, I hope I'm wrong about these new Star Wars movies, and who knows, maybe they'll be great. But right now, I'm just not feeling it. But what do you think? What do you think about the new announced Star Wars films? Are you excited to see Rey back again? How do you feel about Filoni finally getting his own live-action film? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.